Welcome to the November edition of the County Commissioner's Corner. I am your host, facilitator, mediator, moderator, whatever you want to call me, Scott Vargo, and I'm joined by two of our county commissioners, Tamara Pogue and Josh Blanchard. Elizabeth Lawrence, unfortunately, is not able to join us today. So we are going to dive into what is the #1 topic across Summit County and in many cases across Colorado and the country, and that is housing. We have, of course, a crisis of workforce housing availability and affordability here in Summit County, and so I want to talk just a little bit about some of the things that we're working on, some good news in a couple of areas, and talk about some stuff that's going on at the state level. So Josh, why don't I start with you, talk a little bit about short-term rental regulations. That's been obviously a topic of interest across the community. We've been preparing as staff some different opportunities or options around code regulations. So you want to talk a little bit about kind of where we're at in that process?
Absolutely. So taking a step back, about a month ago, Summit County Board of County Commissioners implemented a moratorium for new short-term rental applications in unincorporated Summit County. And this was to give us some time to really delve into the data to understand how the short-term rentals were impacting communities and our housing situation here in Summit County. Over the last month, we've been working very hard to look at that information, and our Summit County staff has been working to provide some different suggestions, recommendations to the board for regulatory changes. So as we're moving into November, we're now going through that public hearing process where we'll be looking at these different recommendations. They need to go through the master planning process, and then they'll come back to the Board of County Commissioners potentially for approvals. What we're looking at essentially is a couple of different types of overlay zones for short-term rentals, what we're calling more of a resort, sort of a traditional resort overlay zone, which would encompass the characteristics that the resort neighborhoods have, particularly Keystone, Copper Mountain, and some of those areas in unincorporated Summit County that resembles the resort environment. And then the second overlay zone would be really what we're sort of considering as neighborhood zones, really looking at sort of these traditional neighborhood areas in Summit County. And within that, multiple license types. So this would allow ultimate flexibility among the homeowners as they're looking at what type of property they owned in a residentially zoned neighborhood, and then what opportunities they have for a short-term rental option. And so, again, we're going through that public process, that hearing process. We encourage folks to reach out to us, give us their suggestions and their ideas. We've gotten a lot of great community input, which has really shaped a lot of the policies that we're looking at right now.
Great, great. Tamara, anything you'd like to add to that?
The only thing I'll add is that as we sort of finalize our changes around STR regulations, and I think it's important to note there's really no community on the Western Slope that is currently being impacted by short-term rentals that is not in some way, looking at their regulatory structure. The challenge, though, for counties is we don't have a whole lot of authority to really impact this issue. Certainly, we have licensing authority, we've got some zoning authority, but we don't have any taxation authority. For example. And so just as we wrap up our structure, the legislature is going to begin contemplating some of the changes that they might make on the state level that might help us as a community offset financially some of the impacts that we're seeing. There was an initial bill that came out of an interim committee around commercial taxation of short-term rentals. That proved to have a lot of implementation issues, and so I don't think that that's the language we're going to see going into session. But I do know that there are at least 2 legislators, probably more, who are looking at different options to help communities like ours really begin to regulate, moderate, minimize some of the impacts that we're all seeing from the short-term rentals, but that also are thoughtful about the fact that short-term rentals do also bring revenue into our communities. And so, as Josh and I advocate to the legislature, we'll certainly continue to advocate for that moderation and that balance that we need to make Summit County work.
Great. And as Josh said, so the process right now is with our Countywide Planning Commission. We expect to bring back some information about the code regulations and the ordinance that sort of goes back with the licensing piece, probably at the tail end of November, and then probably for another reading by the Board of County Commissioners in the middle of December. And so that's just the general timeline that we're working off of right now. Okay, great. Let's see, Tamara, why don't you talk? You are a member of, and I'm going to butcher the name, so I'm just going to say the Housing Task Force at the state level. And so talk a little bit about the work that that group's doing and what their goals are.
Yeah, so last session, the legislature created the Transformative Affordable Housing Task Force. There are two sort of groups that are meeting. The first is a group of legislators, and then the second is a subpanel, which has folks like me on it. And the idea is to give recommendations to the legislature on how to spend $400 million of the state's ARPA funds, American Rescue Plan Act funds, on affordable housing. Things that will really move the needle in the affordable housing space and be truly transformative. You know, I'm the only Western Slope voice on the subpanel, and so it's a little challenging to make sure that these recommendations really do work for communities like ours. But I'm excited that the final recommendations out of the subpanel are being presented to the Legislative Task Force this week and next. And there are 13 recommendations for funding, the two largest of which are a revolving loan fund with zero or low interest capital loans, which will be tremendously helpful for Summit County. And then the second are grants to local governments and nonprofits, which I think will also really move the needle in helping us get some of our projects off the ground. The other thing I'm really excited about is all of these recommendations include what's called horizontal infrastructure, or water, sewer, roads, all of those things that are necessary to have in building an affordable housing development, but traditionally have not been supported or funded really at either the federal or the state levels. And so I'm very excited about that particular recommendation. There's lots of other recommendations coming out of that committee. Certainly some funds for transitional housing or supportive housing for folks who are experiencing substance use disorder. There is dollars in there to help communities like ours transition hotels into workforce housing. There's some more funding that we're recommending around mobile home parks and helping residents stay in that naturally occurring affordable housing. So I'm really proud of the work that we've done, and I am optimistic that the legislature will support some of the recommendations we've made, and that we'll be able to access those funds really as soon as early next summer, late spring.
Tamara, can you talk a little bit about how the subpanel and the legislative panel interact with one another?
Yes. So the subpanel meets on its own, and then we make recommendations to the legislative task force. We've literally been meeting for about 15 hours a week now since, I think, September. Those meetings will continue on to the end of this year. We have both funding recommendations to the legislative task force and also policy recommendations to the task force. The legislative task force will consider all of those recommendations. They're going to take lots of public testimony on all of those recommendations, and then they're going to put together essentially a list of recommendations that will actually go to the full legislature. From there, various bills will be drafted and voted on. So there's a long way to go in this process yet, but certainly I think the fact that there's been early agreement on supporting local governments in building affordable housing, particularly those of us that are in rural and rural resort communities, has been a very important conversation.
Yeah, that's great. Great. Thank you for that. And again, I think that everybody in Summit County should be very pleased with the fact that there is a representative from Summit County that's participating in that group and in those discussions. Wonderful. All right, last thing, which is a good news moment related to housing. And so many folks are familiar with the Wintergreen development in the Keystone area. That was a partnership between Gorman and Company, Vail Resorts, and Summit County government to develop a range of rental housing opportunities on a piece of property that Vail Resorts owns. And when that zoning went through, there was an opportunity for some additional units to be developed. And so, Tamara, you want to talk a little bit about what's called Wintergreen Ridge and where that project is?
I'm really excited about this one. So Wintergreen Ridge is an additional 47 units in that development, so it's additional density in that unit. Gorman will be the master developer on that project. And the really exciting news is that we just heard on Friday that we are receiving loan funds from the Colorado Housing and Finance Authority, which really mean that this project can now move forward quickly. So the fact that we already have infrastructure for that development in place, the fact that we've already built units there, means that it's very easy to go back and then add these additional units quickly. So I don't have the exact timeline yet. Scott, you may, but we are optimistic that that will happen really quickly.
Yeah, so the timeline, as I understand it, in terms of design, et cetera, is about a 10 to 12 month process for them to go through design and entitlements. And then it's about a 18-month build schedule. So they are hopeful that September of 24, people would begin occupying those new units. I'm hoping that there's some opportunity for them to condense some of that timeline and maybe get folks in even a bit sooner. But that's their timeline right now. And again, very exciting. And to Tamara's point, the funding that comes through CHAFA is for low-income housing tax credits, and so that will mean that those rental rates will be between 30 and 60% AMI for those 47 units. And so we know from the latest needs assessment that our biggest challenge within Summit County is those much lower end rental properties and availability. We also know that there's a development within the town of Silverthorne, Blue River Apartments, that is currently a LIHTC project. Those have a certain timeline on them in many cases that they will expire, and so that project is set to expire in December of 2024. And so these new units coming online will at least help to replace some of those if we're not able to come up with some way to try to maintain affordability on those Blue River apartment units. So that's a positive, but we are hoping that we don't lose the Blue River apartments as well.
We are certainly working on that one as well. I mean, I think one of the challenges with building is no matter how fast we try and do it, it still takes a while. And that's why this BOCC and Summit County government is so focused on some of these short-term solutions, like protecting some of the affordable housing that we already have. Blue River Apartments is a really good example of that. But also making sure that we have units that are either that we can convert back into long-term rentals. And so also really excited about some of the work that we're doing in that space that we can talk about as well.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, so I don't know if you guys do want to talk a little bit about the short-term rental incentive program. That is another big piece that, again, at the same time we were doing the regulations, we were rolling out the incentive program as well.
Absolutely. So this is the Lease to Locals program. This is in partnership with the town of Breckenridge. And this is basically an incentive program for folks who had been taking advantage of short-term rental opportunities in Summit County and in Breckenridge, but now can take advantage of basically shifting that to a long-term lease, and can receive cash incentives to help cover sort of that difference between what your sort of income is being a part of a short-term rental program versus being in a long-term rental program. And just within the last few weeks since we've launched this, we've had about 18 or 19, I think is the number, of folks who've started to take advantage of that process. It does require that you lease to a Summit County worker who's working in an industry here in Summit County. So you do, provide housing for locals. That's the goal. And there's still opportunities for folks to be involved. So Scott, maybe you can tell us about the website and where people can go for more info.
So if you type in Lease to Locals, that will bring you to the landing page. There are opportunities there for property owners, property managers, as well as prospective tenants to fill out information, applications, etc. And then there's contact info there as well for them to reach out and get additional information. And I think it's important because this is a program in which the property owner is making available their unit. Before they receive any sort of an incentive, they have to have a signed lease with a local worker. And so that discussion or that negotiation takes place between a prospective tenant and that property owner. And so a property owner may express an interest, but if they're asking for an exorbitant amount in terms of a rent amount, they're not likely to probably find a matchup with a local worker that's going to take advantage of that. And so there is a market factor, a market force there at play in terms of what people can charge or what people are willing to pay.
And I think it's key that this is one of the short-term solutions that we as the BOCC and Summit County government identified. We have a challenge. We know we have a workforce shortage challenge in Summit County, not just for Summit County government, but pretty much across every sector in our community. And as we're ramping up for ski season, we want to make sure that there is inventory out there that can help support our local workforce.
Absolutely, absolutely. Tamara, anything to add?
I think the only thing I'd add is that this incentive program is really a pilot, where nobody else has done something like this to the scale while that we're doing it, we're trying it and seeing if it works. We may need to make some changes, but I do think the initial interest has been, really telling that this is a strategy that can be effective for our workforce. I know, though, that for folks that have been renting in a long-term market for a long time, this can feel like a bitter pill to swallow, and I certainly want everyone to know that I hear that, I agree with that, and I am optimistic that the legislature this session will find some ways to really reward folks that have been in the long-term market for a long time. The other thing I'd add is, I think these strategies all have different goals. So our regulation of short-term rentals, our goal there is to really stop losing workforce housing to short-term rentals. But the goal of those regulations is not to actually gain back housing. The goal of the incentive program is to bring those units back into the market. And so as folks hear and read about all the things that we're doing, just keep in mind that each one of these programs really has very different goals.
Yeah. So we've gone a little bit longer than we planned on this segment, which is great. So we're going to take a break so that we can run some commercials and make some money to continue to fund this operation. None of that is true. But we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back to talk about everybody's favorite subject, which is COVID-19.